Hey, welcome back to a special bonus interview of Interconnected series. I am with a very special individual who has, a lot of range in what he's doing. Dr. Pejman Kadarai is an osteopathic physician. He's a board certified pediatrician. He's fellowship trained in integrative medicine and also endobiogeny, which is basically medical herbalism. Don't hear that often, which is a real treat because we have real sophisticated physicians using evidence-based medicine, looking at how we can use herbs to kind of replace some of the drugs that we're using and get better results. So welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. So look, you're a dad, I'm a dad. And you read all this stuff and it's, a lot of the news I hear about what are endocrine disruptors, what's killing the microbiome, all these things that are out there. It's just like, makes me want to run for the hills and protect my little cubs. But most of us don't have those options. And when you run for the hills, the cities will catch up. So I want to talk about real life strategies in how we can be better stewards of our children's microbiomes, growing up in the towns and the cities that we live in, and some of the offending agents and how you look at it as a pediatrician. Yeah. So that's a lot. Let's start with just kind of your general gestalt of how you look at the microbiome as a pediatrician.
Well, part of why I did all of this training is with each level, initially my fear and worry kept growing, and it was to the point where, you get into a state of borderline paranoia and you're like, oh my God, do I just go live in the mountains somewhere and, kind of dissociate from the rest of society because my kids are going to die, I'm going to die, everyone's going to die. And ultimately that's not helpful for anyone. And, over time, the more I've learned and the more I've studied, the more I've realized the conversation needs to be about how do we increase our resiliency. I mean, it's important to be aware of the stressors, the toxins. In no way is it helpful to have, pesticides around your children. It's not helpful to have, various chemicals in the foods we eat. So all of those things should be good measures. But, at the end of the day, what I do and what I do for my families is also drive the conversation of how do we actually increase the resiliency within our system, so that as different things come along, the system itself will be inherently stronger. So one of the things I actually did for my daughter is when she was, I think, 8 months old, I started giving her sauerkraut and, started getting her used to these fermented foods. So these fermented foods became part of her natural diet and part of the foods that she gravitated towards. Most of my families use probiotics, and I think probiotics are fantastic. And really building these kinds of things into our lifestyle so we can live in the urban setting that we do, we can tolerate some degree of toxicity that becomes an inherent part of life in a place like Los Angeles or wherever people live. And we don't have to be worried about living in a cave. And when you can eat organically, you eat organically. And if you can choose organic foods, you choose organic foods. And if you go out to eat at a restaurant, you don't worry about, whatever crap is in the food, given, the restaurant you're choosing. So that's kind of the general gestalt of how I approach pediatrics and what I try to do for our families, because then it's no longer a matter of living in fear of every stressor that comes along. It's really about being in balance.
Amen. There's this old saying on the martial arts is if you stand in the ring long enough, you're going to get punched in the face, right? But there's also the other side of that, which is like, just be a good boxer. And so we hear these terms a lot through the series is resilience and tolerance, building the tolerance of the system, building the ability of the system to kind of, modulate against these offenders. Yep. Right. And there's plenty. I mean, we talk a lot about, the Roundup and the antibiotics in the food and all that. But again, if you're worried about insults all the time, you're back on your heels running for the hills. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about some winning strategies for what a parent should look at, and look, kids get sick, they're given antibiotics, oftentimes before we knew better. Right. And so it's like, okay, my kids had a couple ear infections. They've gone a couple rounds. Now what? What do I do? How do I re-inoculate? And how do I look at that in a sane way?
Well, I think starting at that kind of basic level, finding a good probiotic that your child will tolerate And either knowing where to buy it or having it readily available in a refrigerator or wherever is a good place to start. As a general rule of thumb, without necessarily promoting one type of probiotic, having something that has multiple different strains, ideally at least 8 different strains, usually of some form of lactobacillus and bifidobacter is great. If you want to get really fancy, there's some soil-based probiotics that you can get, which in some of the sicker patients I use. But having a good probiotic, and for children having around 10 to 15 billion colonies for let's say older than 4 or 5 years of age, and half of that for the younger kids is a great place to have. So if they need to go on the antibiotics, then you say, okay, fine, we need to use these antibiotics. I'll just put my kid on the probiotic. And what I generally suggest is for the families to stay on the probiotics for about a month after the antibiotics are done, to allow the gut to kind of repopulate. And along with this, I think, the caution that I give to families is to realize that the probiotics are not a cure-all. So along with that, eating a healthful diet that has lots of good fiber and lots of good prebiotics, and if you can get your kid to take various fermented foods, I'm into that. And the one thing that I've seen is a lot of families that I consult with, they come in hoping that if I can give them one probiotic, that fixes everything. And these kids are eating gluten, and they're eating processed foods, and they're eating really poor quality dairy. And not to put these foods down, but sadly, in today's time and age, the human system, unfortunately, is intolerant to these food groups in the US. And the inflammation that these foods cause ultimately trigger a host of issues, which then lead to these repeated courses of antibiotics. And I think for families, the other way to look at this conversation, if your child is needing antibiotics regularly, to stand back and really say, why is my child needing all of these antibiotics, and why are they getting sick so often? Because at least from my understanding of the literature, if you take an antibiotic once a year, not that it's ideal, usually the human system has the resiliency to repopulate and kind of repair. If you're taking an antibiotic every month, at some point that is going to really throw off the intestinal tract. And looking at things from that bigger picture standpoint is also really helpful.
Mm-hmm. One of the things, look, by the time my kid has to take an antibiotic, I feel like I failed, right? And look, stuff happens, cuts happen, infections happen.
Yep.
But so how can we kind of swim upstream? And so you're, endobiogeny, right? And all these applications of botanicals and things that are less harsh on the microbiome. How do you look at that as kind of frontline measures against, if a kid's got a sniffles or a sore throat and stuff like that before it gets there?
Great question. The plants have existed for thousands of years. I'm sure through your Chinese medicine background, there's so many uses for the plants. And in today's society, for some reason, we've come to think that our modern pharmaceuticals are really the best tool. Everything that we have is a tool. And, when people come to talk to me, I tell them, I don't necessarily have a bias against antibiotics or for antibiotics. I see them as tools. The more tools you have, the more effectively you can address a problem. So in my practice, for instance, garlic ear oil, which you can find in any Whole Foods, I'd say 80% of the time actually alleviates the need for antibiotics. So when I give an antibiotic for an ear infection, it's basically for that kid who has a fever of 104 and their eardrum is about to burst and they're screaming their head off. But that also means that 8 out of 10 times, I look and I tell the parents, like, here's an antibiotic prescription, but go get the garlic ear oil. And they use it, and I check in with them 3 days later, they're like, yep, he's fine. I didn't need it. And garlic is probably one of the most beautiful antimicrobials out there. It has antibacterial properties, antiviral properties. And most of the time, it takes care of things like a simple ear infection.
Yep.
When it comes to coughs and colds, it's a sad reality, because what I see in a lot of my colleagues is, because they have nothing else to offer, because the medical system has told them that really nothing else is helpful and basically prescribe antibiotics if you don't know what else to do, they're kind of in a bind. And for me, most of the time, we don't have to go for antibiotics when it comes to upper respiratory infections. So coughs and colds, my families have blends of eucalyptus. We have our own essential oil blend, but our families have their own little pharmacy. You can buy eucalyptus for $10 off the shelf. Some families get lavender. Thyme is actually one of the most beautiful antimicrobial essential oils out there. So families can build their own little pharmacies at home. And when the kids get sick, they have these essential oils that they can do chest rubs with. And for the older kids, past 5, 6 years of age, they can actually inhale some of these oils, which actually alleviates the symptoms of a cold. So when the child comes in, they have a legitimate pneumonia that needs antibiotic. And in my practice, probably once a month, I'm prescribing an antibiotic. And this is for the entire population of kids I'm taking care of. Because most of the time, we don't have to go there, fortunately. But this also comes from us having the hard work. The families are doing all the hard work. They're eating a certain way. The kids are ultimately, they're getting the nutrients they need. Zinc is actually something that I find is really undervalued. Probably about 10, 15% of kids have a zinc deficiency. And medically, we think of zinc as a deficiency that causes like eczema and skin rashes, but it turns out that zinc is the most important nutrient to actually help the gut heal. When you have a zinc deficiency, the gut integrity actually falls apart and the gut can heal. You give kids a few milligrams of zinc, and a week or two later, all of a sudden their digestive functioning is improved, which then alleviates the need for antibiotics, which then keeps the microbiome happy.
Quick question on something that you said, I don't want to leave it, is you mentioned that once a kid turns 5 or 6, then they could use some of these oils to inhale. So what happens for kids under that age? Why would that be contraindicated for respiratory?
You just have to be careful. In my practice, because I'm very careful about the types of oils we're using and I'm watching over the kids, I'll diffuse essential oils in 2 or 3-year-olds. But I think if you're picking stuff off the shelf, so like for instance, eucalyptus, the regular eucalyptus that's available is a form of eucalyptus that actually could be irritating to their airways. Eucalyptus radiata, which is a more benign form, you can actually diffuse in 2 or 3-year-olds, no problems. So when I make recommendations for the public, I'm presuming that they're grabbing whatever eucalyptus that's at Whole Foods, not even checking it out, and giving them that kind of safety margin so no kid ends up in trouble. Kind of that motto, first do no harm.
Sure. But there are forms of eucalyptus and oils that can be used.
For sure. Yeah. And if you just know what product to look for and know how to use it safely, you can easily use it in a 2, 3, 4-year-old child. Yeah. It's just knowing that safety margin. And that's part of why I've been so lucky to have this training, because the essential oils we use in the clinic are of a particular chemotype with a specific subtype and blah, blah, blah. And I don't want to bore your viewers to death, but yeah.
Yeah. And so there's a lot there. And so the challenge is a lot of our viewers are going to be like, all right, well, my pediatrician, this doctor's in LA. I can't get my kids there. My pediatricians, I'm going to go in there and I'm going to tell them this thing and they're going to go, bah, right? And in my experience, a lot of doctors are becoming much more open to this. And so it's about crossing that bridge and kind of understanding how to have that conversation. And a lot of it also is like, I remember back in clinical practice, there's just different norms. So, there would be different expectations of the physician. Like if we had a Hispanic patient, they didn't feel like they got their money's worth unless we gave them a shot. Right. Because psychologically, it's like you go to the doctor and you get a shot. Right. And so there's cultural norms and all these types of things. And so like people and to what you were saying, people go to the doctor and it's just like, well, I came all the way over here and you told me to eat better. Like, where's my prescription? Well, like, give me something. Right. I waited in your waiting room. I did all this stuff. Your job is to dispense something. Yep. It creates all these challenges, right? Psychologically. Yeah.
And, that's where I think the mindset becomes important. And, the families that I work with, so I'll see families in consultation. Usually the people that have come to see me are the ones that have already hit their head against the wall a few times. And, their kid has gotten 15 courses of antibiotics in 1 year. And they're at a point where they're like, we don't know what the hell is going on, but we need help. But I think staying in that space of openness and readiness, and, if you want, I'm happy to share some of the information with your viewers that has simple, easy guidelines of things they can get, through Whole Foods or wherever else, of various tricks they can use so that they don't have to end up in trouble. Because when you're not ready and you get hit, it's like surfing and you're not preparing for a wave that's coming, and then the wave comes and then you get clobbered and you're tumbling underneath for a good 30 seconds. Whereas if you're ready and the wave comes, you can get the most beautiful ride in and it becomes an enjoyable experience.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of this really is a matter of readiness and knowing what tools will work for your child to ultimately help them.
Well, let's get into it. Let's get into some of the nitty gritty. Let's do some actionable, what you would tell your patients as they, come in to see you. I would love that.
Okay, sure. So a really simple, good tasting product that people can buy is actually Briar Rose or Rosa Canina. Soroyal and Herbal Gems and Boiron actually make this product. Briar Rose. Briar Rose.
Mm-hmm.
And then the formal name is Rosa, Rosa Canina. Briar Rose actually turns out to be a decongestant, a mild immune booster, and overall just a systemic kind of tonifier. It's almost like Eleutherococcus or Siberian ginseng is for adults.
Mm.
It has this tonifying, supportive property. For the kids that get sick often, what I do is have the children take a small amount of this plant on a regular basis during the wintertime. And kids love it because it tastes good. It's a glycerin extract. It's sweet. You can mix it with water, not hard to take. And for the Boiron and Soroyal products, for a 1 to 3-year-old, 1 milliliter is generally sufficient. And then 3 to 6-year-olds, they can take about 2 milliliters each day. What also could be done is right when a child is getting sick, you basically give them a double or triple dose of that for a few days, which also helps as kind of a decongestant to help their bodies process this. I think in terms of all the available products that kids will be willing to take, that is something that's fantastic. For some of our more adventurous families whose kids are also much more tolerant, I'm sure you've used Yin Chow.
Sure.
Which is the Chinese blend. Con Herbs is a great company that's organic that sells it. Yin Chow is pretty disgusting tasting. So
super bitter.
Super bitter. But you know what? There's a handful of kids that love this stuff. And I'm shocked because I cringe every time I take it. But some of our families, give it to the kids and the kids just love it. And Yin Chow is amazing. It's amazing. You take that right at the onset of a cold, and the cold within 24, 48 hours really dissipates. When, depending on the family, what I tell people is right when your child is getting sick, you should avoid gluten and dairy to just minimize the congestion that's there. So I think from a dietary standpoint, dropping the sugar, dropping the wheat, dropping the dairy, just to minimize congestion and inflammation is helpful. And over time, honestly, the thing that I found to be most helpful are the essential oils. So in kind of my list of favorites, Eucalyptus radiata, so radiata, that is the subtype of eucalyptus that's actually safe to inhale. And in over 2 years of age, what I generally have families do, depending on the child's health and constitution, is they could mix 2 to 3 drops of this essential oil in about half a teaspoon of olive oil and just rub it right into the lymph nodes and onto the chest. So you actually do a little bit of aromatherapy and it actually gets right into the lymph nodes. Along with that, a few other essential oils that people can use. Lavender, people don't know, actually has some antimicrobial properties. It's an antispasmodic, which basically means it stops airway spasm, which is generally where coughs come from. And it's also quite soothing and just nice in terms of smell. If families can find thyme, especially thyme borneol or thyme linalool, so Borneol, or linalool, which is the one that I generally see more availably, Linolol. Thyme, if you actually look, has antimicrobial properties. So it's an antiviral, antibacterial. It breaks up mucus. It actually keeps the airways from going into full spasm. And in some of the studies that I've seen, when it comes to H flu and some of the forms of strep, they've actually found this oil to have antimicrobial properties against some of those bacteria that actually end up causing ear infections, pneumonias, and so forth. So you could do little blends of these oils, a few drops of each, and as a general rule of thumb, in a 1-year-old, I have parents do 1 to 2 drops combined of these oils in about half a teaspoon, and they can just rub it on the back and feet, because the younger children can go into airway spasm if they breathe the oils directly. After about 2 years of age, you can actually do a neck massage, and I would keep the oils on a lighter side of maybe 2 to 3 drops diluted 2 or 3 times a day.
Olive oil as the carrier oil.
In a carrier oil. You don't want to apply these oils directly because it'll irritate the skin, and 2, it actually won't penetrate into the skin. So you actually want these oils to get into the body and start having their effect rather than just popping off the skin and going into the air. After 3 years of age, you can use about 3 to 4 drops as a chest rub and on the neck, and that would go until around 5, 6 years of age. Again, depending on the child. If your child has allergies, they're super sensitive, they have asthma, they break out all the time, you need to be a lot more cautious. If your child has been super, super healthy, have no issues, and you could test this out on their feet first if you want, but they do well, you can actually apply these oils directly. And then after about 3 years of age, again, presuming the child doesn't have severe allergies and asthma, a really simple thing to do is put some of these oils in a bowl of hot water, or just lukewarm water, just hot enough so the oils will start evaporating. Put 2 or 3 drops, put a towel over the child's head or your own, and actually inhale these oils. And if you could do that, what I found a lot of times is probably within 36, 48 hours, the symptoms of a cold will start going away, because these oils have actually started killing off some of the viruses and helped your immune system kind of recover.
Yeah, that's great. It's funny, as growing up, when we would get sick, my mom would go literally like down the street, pick eucalyptus leaves, throw them in a pot, boil it, throw a towel over our heads, and we'd just huff it until, sinuses would clear. Didn't get sick that often, right? Just beat it before it gets to you.
Yeah. And you know what? That's what they were doing. They were diffusing these essential oils. Like the old school remedies, when you really look at them, there was so much power and just wisdom in these simple things that were taken for granted.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you throw the baby out with the bathwater. Yeah. So speaking of which, as we cross over into this conversation about the microbiome, the problem, and the reason we're talking about all this stuff is some of the deleterious effects of the antibiotics and some of the harsher drugs on the microbiome. And, we want to harbor these colonies. We want the body to stay resilient and stay strong. And so, obviously if you're coming out of the cold, maybe dairy is off. But so what do you recommend? I mean, my kids do eat sauerkraut, and I'm lucky like you, they have like smoked salmon and sauerkraut at breakfast, and, they're an anomaly, but we started them early, right? You get their palate used to it, and you give them probiotics so that they adapt to it. But a lot of kids are fussy with food. So how do you deal with fussy kids and getting the right kind of foods that are probiotic friendly?
Well, there's a certain degree of fussiness that is unavoidable. A lot of 2-year-olds, a lot of 3-year-olds, also depending on, what environment they're in, if they're schooled or exposed to things, will ultimately fight back and push back. I also believe that to some extent, and, this isn't to point the finger at anyone or say anyone's doing wrong, but I think there's also something to be said about parents holding on to their beliefs and saying, you know what, son, I know you don't want to eat this, but we're going to try it anyways. And, with the 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, once their language is in, I start having conversations of like, can you take one bite of something, one bite of broccoli, one bite of, whatever. And I think a lot of times we have disempowered our families into thinking that what is what just all that there is. So sometimes when you take baby steps and you start coaxing the child of like, okay, just take one bite of this, whether it's a piece of carrot to start or broccoli or, sauerkraut, but, you can start easily and kind of keep nudging the child to go into a certain direction. And part of what I feel honored about is I have some families, that have the 2.5, 3-year-olds that go to birthday parties, kind of poke at the cupcakes and look at the parents and be like, this isn't what I want. And then they go and like ask for vegetables. And I think some of this is the mindset that we can ingrain into the children. And like for me, when I counsel our families in terms of what foods to start, the first foods that I tell families to start in the 4 or 5, 6 month old is actually bitter greens. Because if the child starts thinking that spinach and kale and chard are actually good foods, and we keep nurturing that as time passes, hopefully this will become a regular part. And I'd love to hear how you pulled off this miracle of getting your children to eat these foods. And
yeah, I mean, look, we tore out our back lawn. I live in California and we have a water crisis anyway. So we tore out the back lawn and put in 6 raised beds and just started gardening since they were like, crawling. And so they'd just be out there, soil bacteria, all of it, dogs in the house and just eating tomatoes and basil off, out of the garden.
uh-huh.
And you start working it. You look at some of this literature and say like, oh, I have a deficiency in bacteria that would break down oxalates, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like, it's not as easy. And you find that in kids sometimes. It's like, some of those bacteria just aren't there yet. But if you start building the diversity and exposing them early, especially before they get to the dumb school mentality of other kids, who are showing up, it's the lowest common denominator. The kid with the sugar gets to be the cool kid for a minute. And so, if you could get them exposed to not even liking and not having a sweet tooth and not having the yeast or the overgrowth happening at such an early age, my kids don't really like birthday cake. And every once in a while they have sugar. You're like, whoa. How'd that go for you, right? They don't really love it because they just don't have a sweet tooth. And I think it started with us doing what you did, which is start with the bitters, start with the herbs, the botanicals.
Yeah. And, in a lot of kids, once they get past a certain stage, sugar becomes something they're curious about, but it's ultimately overwhelming and not of desire for them. Mm. And, I think another element to what you touched on is there's a certain unhealthy fear of children being in the environment. I tell some of our families whose kids, like they have a propensity for allergies, is take your kids hiking, let them be in the dirt. My daughter climbs around and sometimes she puts, some rather disgusting stuff in her mouth. My wife is like pulling her hair out and I'm just standing there. I'm like, those were good probiotics that just went in her body.
That's it.
I think giving the children a chance to be children in natural environments. And if you live in an apartment, take your children out for a walk in the park or somewhere where the soil is clean and just let them be covered in dirt. Hmm. And, this is the inoculation that is actually most helpful because probiotics could be really helpful coming out of, whole foods. But ultimately, we're finding that the diversity of the microflora and the soil-based organisms and having multiple different organisms be present in healthful numbers is actually how we obtain the type of microbiome that's most resilient and ultimately most protective. So I think, when you're buying food from the farmer's market, my wife gets crazy still because I don't really wash those vegetables. If I know they were grown in a good, healthy soil, I will leave most of that soil actually onto the food. And then as I'm giving it to my daughter, sometimes it's a secret, I know that I'm inoculating her body with this. Or if you have the luxury of growing your own vegetables, and that soil is clean, clean in a non-chemical way, but right. Allowing these particles to actually be ingested, it could be some of the best ways for us to protect ourselves.
It's funny is we have a rule in my household where it's always shoes on, wash your hands when you're in the front yard, because the front yard means there's street and oil and the association is spraying stuff that's out of my control. In the backyard, I don't care what they're doing, barefoot, anything back there can go in their mouths. It doesn't matter because I know that I have a clean, natural environment versus like a petroleum-based, who knows what environment. Yeah. And so you got to kind of mitigate some of those things in this modern world that we live in. But man, I mean, dirt, right? So you're hearing this from a pediatrician, right? Like, get your kids in the dirt.
Yeah. And, maybe 10, 15 years ago, this would have been crazy talk, but there's so much information out there now really supporting this notion of early exposure to every kind of antigen, whether it's dust or peanuts, for instance, or whatever else, and just helping the immune system become familiar with what is in the world could be so helpful to not just help strengthen the microorganisms within the microbiome, but help balance the entire body so that it can tolerate and be in harmony with the environment that we're in.
Amen. Here's a controversial one. I just want to get your opinion on it. Everyone's talking about vaccines. What's your take on that as an integrative doc who's seen a lot of families, and what you see there?
What I tell all of our families is that I think both sides have taken this conversation way too far. If you look at the data that even the CDC provides suggests that most of our vaccines are not 100%. We don't know if they're 99%. Sometimes they're less than that. So for instance, we know that the whooping cough vaccine, that within 2 to 3 years of administration, the protective effects against whooping cough wane, meaning it pretty much resolves. So some of these conversations that we have that there's a whooping cough outbreak and that's because people have not vaccinated are really far-fetched and not entirely accurate, because the fact is that the vaccine itself is not doing what it should be, and they're actually talking about revamping the whooping cough vaccine so it becomes more effective for that. I think the other side of this conversation is that we have created this fear, unfortunately on both sides, that it's kind of a one size fits all, meaning if you don't vaccinate, you're going to kill your child and you're going to ruin society. And then the flip side of it is there's a camp that has come to believe the vaccines are the cause of all disease. And in my experience, in my observation, I have to admit that, 5 years ago, I was hell-bent that vaccines are the cause of every issue, because the Th1, Th2 imbalance, all of this conversation, I was totally convinced that this was the case until I was the one injecting the children in my practice with the vaccines and then checking in with the families at 1 month. Now we've got 5-year-olds, and seeing that, 90, 95, 98% of the kids can take the vaccines and actually do just fine. I think one of the problems is, in addition to this very kind of intense dual-sided conversation, is that there's a small margin of children who genetically, physiologically, whether it's their microbiome and the mutations they have and God knows what else, physiologically, they are incapable of processing toxins and stressors. And ultimately, if a big enough stressor comes along, their systems will tip over and either have an autoimmune response or a metabolic collapse, which is basically what autism is. Metabolically, these kids are just completely deranged and cannot handle their own system functioning. So it's kind of like, imagine you can be in Hawaii where it rains every day and you can throw a match in the grass and you're never going to cause a fire. Mm-hmm. A few weeks ago here in California, when the humidity dropped 10% or below, you can throw a match anywhere and you will cause a devastating forest fire. What we don't take into account is the human being that's receiving the vaccine. And we want to pretend that the vaccines are either 100% safe and effective or 100% harmful and problematic. And I believe that somewhere in the middle is where the answers are. There are actually people out of the Mayo Clinic and other places where they're looking at vaccinomics, which is basically the study of how our genome influences vaccine outcomes in terms of how well the vaccines work, and also how vaccines could be problematic and what are the individuals, the 0.5%, 1%, 2%, we don't know, that cannot handle the vaccinations because of their own systems. And if we ever got to a place where we were smart enough and we do a little swab on someone and say, you shouldn't be getting any vaccines, and 99% of the people could get the vaccines and we know for sure they will not have problems, I think that would actually resolve a lot of the discord that's there. And at the end of the day, it's because you got the 1 or 2% that have been harmed, that are screaming bloody murder. And that 1 or 2% is now being generalized to the entire population. And, to some extent, you can't argue with people saying, I don't know if my kid is going to be harmed. And
right. How do I know I'm not going to be one of those people?
Yeah. I tell all of our families, I don't think your child will have an issue, but I don't have a magic ball and I cannot guarantee they will not have a vaccine reaction. And, I think that is the honest truth. Most kids do fine, but not everyone. And for us to disregard the 0.5 or 1% is sad.
It's rude and dismissive, but it's also created this war where I think it's created a lot of issues. I've heard some talk about the microbiome and having a healthy microbiome helping modulate that. But again, look, there's, death by a thousand, lashes here. I mean, there's so many things that can tip someone over. And so, I'd like to kind of round this conversation out about that word, right? Tolerance, or the word resilience, where we started, right? If you can build the resilience of this child's system, microbiome up, doing probiotic living and, kind of mitigating the toxins and the damage and all those things, and giving this child a fighting chance to really kind of stand in the world that we live in, that seems like a sound strategy, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, in today's age, I think that's really what this needs to be about. Not living in a place of fear, because ultimately that's not what you want for your child. But, a mentor of mine, JJ Virgin, that I'm working with, she said something brilliant. She said, and this was one of her mentors, she's like, don't ask for things to be easier. Ask for yourself to be stronger. And I think if we look at it in that, how do we help the individual be so strong that while we live healthfully and we're mindful of the toxins and we're mindful of the antibiotics and we're mindful of all of these different things that are just not healthy for us to begin with, we also have a human being that has the resiliency to handle things when they do come and they don't fall over and suddenly go into a state of disease because of the smallest insult.
I love that. I love that. That's, it's funny is that I'm a martial artist, and the literal translation of Kung Fu, there's two ways to translate the words Kung Fu, which is hard work or eat bitter. And both of which have implications, which is like, how are you building your resilience to withstand what life throws at you instead of worrying about where the next punch is coming, right? You just get stronger, be ready, right? Yeah. And I love that as an operating system, as a parent, right? Is how do I build these kids up to, they don't listen, your kid goes to college as a freshman. By the time they are a senior in college, the job that they were training for is already expired in the world that we live in. So it's about building an adaptive child that can learn to learn and learn to grow and move, right? In the marketplace, but also, when we're talking about health, it's about having that capacity to do so. Doc, this has been great. Can I bother you for some resources that I could put in the companion guide for some of the stuff that maybe you would hand out to parents coming into your clinic?
Absolutely.
That'd be lovely. Just more resources.
I'd love to do that. And we actually have, we did a cold and flu update, which kind of goes through everything from diet to oils you can use to, these various supplements and where to get them from even. And I'd be happy to share that with you and your viewers.
Awesome.
Because ultimately, this is about helping people be healthy, and I'd love to do that.
Love it. Thank you. So we'll get that offline. We'll share it in our companion guide and all else. Dr. Pejman Kadarai, thank you so much. It's heartwarming to know that there's pediatricians like you doing this on the front line, and I'm encouraging any doctor who's watching this to really take this type of training and kind of become more adaptive as well. There are better ways of frankly just putting more tools in the toolbox, right? And it gives us choices.
Yeah. Well, thank you for taking this time. I appreciate it.
Thank you.